But first, I'd like to give a little brief announcement. I'd like to remind everyone that this is the penultimate presentation in our Darwin Condon annual seminar series, and that the next presentation will actually be a dinner and talk next week, next Friday the 28th from 5 to 8 p.m. And that's actually a reservation required event. There will be dinner and wine tasting, followed by a presentation by Southern Oregon Professor Gregory Jones talking about the complexities of substrate, climate change, and wine production. Thinking specifically about upcoming climate change and how that might affect wine production in Oregon. Okay. Tonight is the last night to get a reservation for that event. And we're selling tickets outside of the auditorium here, so if you'd like, after the seminar today, please go out and see JP in here. She's outside. So see JP outside. Tickets are $45 for members and $55 for members of the public, but that $55 ticket fee includes a one-year membership, so that's actually going to be good. All right, so that's next Friday. Tonight we're going to be hearing from Dr. Eisenberg, who comes to us from Oregon State University, where she teaches about ecological restoration and public policy. And her research focuses on the role of wolves in the overall trophic cascades of Rocky Mountain ecosystem. And today she's actually going to be focusing more on Oregon ecosystems and wolves there, potential wolves and actual wolves. Okay. Interestingly, we just connected because she's working on a new book about the role of climate change and conservation of wolves, and she was in part inspired by the work of my mentor from Berkeley, and so I think it's very interesting. We're seeing here the confluence of conservation biology and conservation paleobiology, and that's part of the beauty of a natural history museum, is bringing together ideas from modern systems and past systems and thinking about conservation for the future. That book's upcoming. She has another book that's about to come out in May of 2014 called The Carnivore Way, Coexisting with and Conserving America's Predators. And that's also a very intriguing book because it looks at both the deep time history through the fossil record and modern natural history of important carnivores in North American ecosystems, and thinking about their importance for ecosystem function and conserving that ecosystem. Okay, and then she has another book, I lost it, The Wolf's Tooth. Yes, which is talking specifically about keystone predators and the way that predators can be important in controlling trophic cascades. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing what she has to say about Oregon's ecosystems and the role of wolves and Oregon's ecosystem. So please, let's welcome Dr. Eisenberg.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay. So that's an Oregon wolf that you're seeing on the screen. And the wolves in Oregon are doing what wolves do, and they're spreading like wildfire. They're one of nature's most resilient species. They have a high reproductive rate, and tonight I'm going to tell you their story, both from a science perspective and their deep time story in Oregon, but also what's happening today with how our human relationships with wolves. So these are my two books. The Carnivore Way will be out in 2 months. And in these books, I talk about the wolf's tooth, why keystone predators are essential to having healthy ecosystems anywhere, whether it's the deep ocean or a place like Oregon, and what has happened since, what happened because we removed them and what's happening now that we're letting them come back. And in the Carnivore Way, I talk about the deep time history of 6 endangered and threatened carnivores in the West. And the wolf is one of them. So I'm going to start tonight by talking about taxonomy, because really you need to look at where species come from to really understand our conservation for these species today. Their natural history. So what makes a wolf a wolf? The ecological impacts of having a wolf in a place like Oregon. Specifically, what's happened to wolves in Oregon, as what we did to them to remove them, and then how they're coming back. And finally, I'll be talking about coexistence. So today, there's a lot of promise in this era of wolf recovery in Oregon, but there are also challenges, and ultimately, they're about our human relationships with these apex predators. So taxonomy, some people, when they hear about taxonomy, their eyes glaze over. But it's really essential. This is where you have to start. If you're going to be able to answer questions about what wolves need or what they are or understand their conservation challenges and what their strengths and weaknesses are as a species, you really need to start with their taxonomy. So taxonomy is the science of naming things. And really, taxonomy started with Pliny the Elder, his Historia Naturalis in the 1st century AD. He created a method of naming things that was then followed up on centuries later. These names are based on traits that species share. And it's the way nature literally is a tangled bank. And so starting in the Greco-Roman era, people wanted to make some kind of sense of this and understand it better. And it had to do with philosophy. So philosophers were trying to define our relationship with the natural world. In taxonomy, we have a binomial system, and Pliny the Elder was the first one who came up with that concept. So there's a genus name and a species name. Although he created these ideas, nothing happened for a long, long time. So his work was 1st century AD. It wasn't until Linnaeus came along, and that was in 1758, that he followed up, and then he created the system that we use today. So there's two types of taxonomists. They classify everything, and we can classify them into the lumpers and the splitters. So let's start with the wolf. The wolf genus Canis developed in North America in the late Miocene epoch, about 10 million years ago. So it started in North America. This genus arose here. And this is the forerunner of all the canids that we have today, the coyotes, the wolves, domestic dogs. But by the early Pleistocene epoch, that was 1.5 million years ago, wolves had started to split off from coyotes, and we know this from the fossil record. And they crossed into Eurasia via the Bering Land Bridge, and they continued to develop there into Canis lupus, and that just means dog wolf. So these Latin names have meanings, and they were chosen for those meanings. They're not just random Latin words. So this is the dire wolf. And there's some misconceptions about this animal. It evolved in the mid-Pleistocene, 700,000 years ago. Wolves returned from Eurasia, crossed back over that bridge. The dire wolf, though, it's a species that originated in North America. And so while all these wolves that had crossed that Bering Land Bridge were doing their things in Eurasia, the dire wolf was evolving here. Now, most people think that the dire wolf is this monster wolf that's twice the size of the wolf we have today. Well, I took this picture. I was lecturing in the UK, and this is the British Museum of Natural History, has this whole exhibit on mammals, and this is a dire wolf, a full mounted specimen. And it is approximately 20% smaller than today's wolves. However, its head, its jaws, its teeth are twice the size of the teeth that today's wolves have. And so when people would find dire wolf skulls and their teeth, they thought that this meant that the whole animal was a much bigger animal, and it wasn't. And the dire wolf spread not just North America, but all the way down to the tip of South America. So the first wave of Pleistocene recolonization, so you imagine these European wolves, Eurasian wolves, they started coming back across that land bridge in waves. And that's what created the wolf species and subspecies that we have today. So I'm going to focus on the West in this talk. So the first wave brought what is today known as the Mexican gray wolf to the southwestern US, Canis lupus baileyii. The second wave brought the plains wolf, Canis lupus nubilis. The third wave brought the Alaskan wolf. It's also known popularly as a timber wolf. It's Canis lupus occidentalis. And the plains wolf, out of all of these, was the most widely distributed. It became extinct in 1926. Note that it once was distributed throughout the West, throughout the plains, and all the way to portions of Alaska. And it's known as the buffalo wolf. This is a painting, a Caitlin painting. These wolves were all over the plains. They were distributed into what is today Montana and Idaho. And yes, this is a subspecies. It went extinct because humans killed it. But when we reintroduced wolves, we didn't have that subspecies to reintroduce again, so we used nubilis. The dire wolf, on the other hand, it went extinct about 8,000 years ago. Nobody really knows why. It may be that Canis lupus was a lot more adaptable than the dire wolf. Maybe it was a better hunter. Nobody really knows. This is a mystery. Anyway, this is a Mexican wolf, and I want to back up before I get to the Mexican wolf here. Okay, look at this picture. So this is a wolf. This is a picture from Alaska, from Denali. There are some important key features that this animal has. Note that its tail does not sweep the ground. It has extremely long legs, so its tail only goes halfway down along its legs. So that is called a field mark. So if you see a canid in the distance, and all of the wolves that we have right now in the West, you can distinguish them from coyotes because their tails are a lot shorter relative to their body than coyotes. These wolves, they stand, let's say about 32 inches at the shoulder. That's really tall. Coyotes are a third the size of a wolf. So the leg length and the tail length are some of the key field marks to this animal. So now we're going to look at the Mexican wolf. That's a Mexican wolf. It has long legs and a short tail. It's a lot browner in color. It's much smaller than the other wolf subspecies. It probably is about 20% smaller. Until recently, biologists thought that there were 24 subspecies of wolf. But in the early 1990s, we determined using DNA studies that there's far fewer, and that the subspecies we have identified, they correspond to those waves of recolonization back in deep time. So, natural history. Some say that wolves are the closest to humans in their social structure and how they relate to each other than any other species, except maybe animals like chimpanzees and gorillas. They're highly social. I've worked with wolves for a decade, and I've watched them with their pups and their social interactions, and they have a family structure that really resembles a human family. So there's an alpha male and female. Those are like a human mom and dad. But there's complexities in these relationships. So the alpha male and the alpha female are not the toughest, meanest wolves. They're the wisest ones. And I've seen alpha males be astonishingly gentle with their pups and let the pups attack them over and over again, doing play wrestling, and pretend to lose when a pup that's half grown attacks them in play. So there's a lot of give and take in these wolf families. They have a really high reproductive rate for a large mammal. The larger a mammal gets, the fewer young it usually produces. And wolves are a pretty good-sized mammal, and they produce anywhere from 4 to 6 pups. That's the median range. And of those 4 to 6 pups, almost all of them survive to adulthood. That's unusual. So if you leave wolves to their own devices, if they have lots of food, their numbers will go up like this. And I'm going to show you how that works. They need a lot of space. They cover a lot of ground. I have had radio collars on wolves that I've studied and watched them cover 40 miles in one day. So they have large home ranges, and when they become young adults, about half of the wolves in a pack will leave home. Just like in a human family, teenagers will leave home eventually when they become young adults. So they're an obligate carnivore. They can only eat meat. So coyotes can eat a lot of different things. They can eat vegetation. Wolves can't digest anything that isn't meat and extract any kind of nourishment from it. And they evolved, going back into deep time, everything about them is evolved for killing ungulates. Those are hooved animals. So you could say that something like a wolf co-evolved with something like an elk. And I wrote about that in The Wolf's Tooth. Those relationships are very tightly coupled. And when you remove the wolf, an elk stops being able to act like an elk. And I'm going to explain how that works in a little while. One of the reasons the wolf has done so well, it's one of the most widely distributed mammals at one time in North America, is that it's a generalist. It can live anywhere from the high Arctic to arid deserts. It can endure temperatures of -70 comfortably. It can go for 3 weeks without food. It's impervious to pain. It's a very, very adaptable species. So conservation biologists, they rank the resilience of ecosystems, of species. The wolf has a very high resiliency rating. This image shows you what the distribution of wolves were. If you go back, let's see. This is the lavender is its current range, and this was its former range. Okay? And I'm going to be showing you other range maps. But this species was one of the very first species listed under the Endangered Species Act in the United States. In Alaska, it's managed as a game species, and in Canada as well, and now in the Northern Rocky Mountains since it was delisted. So it's being managed. You buy a hunting tag and you can kill a wolf. The reason for that in the far north is that there's so many of them, and we have 70,000 wolves in North America today. And I'll talk more about recovery in a little bit. But in the far north, in places like Alaska, the reasoning is there's so many of them, they're not going to go extinct, so we can hunt them. However, indigenous people, primitive humans, did not hunt wolves. There's no evidence that humans were hunting wolves until now. So because wolf meat is not very edible, doesn't make good food for people. So they're protected in the western states of Washington, Oregon, California, Utah, and Colorado. And in May of 2013, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service filed a petition in the Federal Register to delist Canis lupus throughout the lower 48 states, and with the exception of the Mexican wolf, Canis lupus baileyii. So this is what I call the carnivore way. Most of the large carnivores in the United States are distributed in the West. And so this is wolf distribution, right? And here's Oregon. It gets this little corner of distribution. So you could see wolves are pretty widely distributed until you get to about here. What happened was that as European settlement progressed and as humans became more involved in agriculture, we started killing any predator, especially wolves. So in the United States, by the early 1900s, they had gone extinct from most places. In the United Kingdom, they were extirpated 200 years ago. In other European nations, they were extirpated earlier than that, like by the late 1600s. And this extirpation had to do with fear. This is a T-Rex head. But I did a lot of archival research as a conservation biologist to understand how we were able to wipe out all of these large carnivores everywhere, worldwide. I wanted to know, why did we do this? You know, because for many, many years, humans had been living quite peacefully with large carnivores. There isn't a lot to suggest that we were running around trying to kill all of them before. And certainly they did present a threat from time to time, and those animals that were a threat were killed. Humans did what they had to do to protect themselves and their families. But there was a lot of coexistence, and that's evidenced in some of the cave paintings, for example. I looked at medieval manuscripts, and I'm going to show you one image. This isn't from the medieval era. This is Little Red Riding Hood. I found the first edition of Little Red Riding Hood at 1785. So there's this wolf mythology that arose about the same time that Pliny the Elder was doing his work, and it persisted, and it caused people to fear anything that was wild and uncontrollable. And so we thought that progress meant killing anything that was uncontrollable and potentially a threat. And certainly animals with big teeth could be a threat. So in Oregon, there's a lot of information about wolves in Oregon. A very good place to look is the Oregon Wolf Conservation and Management Plan. It has a literature review that talks about wolf history going back to the mid-1800s. But wolves were historically very abundant in Oregon. And in 1805, Lewis and Clark reported wolves near the mouth of the Columbia River. In 1832, Captain Nathaniel Wyeth noted lots of wolves along the Deschutes River. Lansford Hastings in 1845 noted the presence of wolves in his Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. And Vernon Bailey, he worked for the U.S. Biological Survey, which is a precursor to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And one of the things he had to do was do a survey of all the large mammal species and prepare reports of their history. And he collected all of the records that he could find, and then he synthesized them. So you can still look at Vernon Bailey's work. It's fascinating to look at his work. He did a lot of work on the mammals of Oregon. And he wrote that in 1854, a fellow by the name of Suckley collected wolf specimen near the Dow and reported them numerous throughout Oregon and Washington, from the Cascades to the summit of the Rocky Mountains, and especially in Blue Mountain country. Now, what we're seeing is that wolves that we have in Oregon today were not reintroduced. They came across the Snake River. They were part of the wolves that were reintroduced in the northern Rocky Mountains. And the places where they're settling are the places where these historical records showed the highest densities of wolves historically. And that's exactly what's happened in the northern Rockies. The places where the wolves in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming have settled are the same places where those wolves were formally denning and present in high number. And so it's interesting to see how these patterns are repeating themselves. So in Oregon, as in most other places, there was a wolf bounty. And between 1913 and 1946, almost 400 wolves were taken. So this wolf bounty, the federal government wanted every wolf removed. And also, this didn't just pertain to wolves at all. Cougars were also involved in this, bears. The bounty was $20. That's huge. $20 in 1913 was, I don't know how much that would be in today's dollars, but it was an enormous amount of money. And so people worked very hard. It was quite an incentive to kill these carnivores. So there were people that were censusing Oregon wolf populations. By 1929, wolf numbers had gotten pretty low in Oregon. The ones that were left at that point were the ones that were very clever and able to hide well. But this is a population estimate. And the National Forest System had been created at that point. It was created around the turn of the last century. But the names of some of these national forests have since been changed. But so there were 90 wolves left in Oregon as far as, and this was a pretty systematic survey for wolves. And this is their distribution. The last Oregon wolf was trapped in 1946. So that was the last wolf. And now they're back. So in trying to find out, understand how we could kill all these wolves, I went to Aldo Leopold's work. How many of you are familiar with Aldo Leopold? Oh, this is wonderful, almost all of you. Well, I looked at his papers before they were digitized when I was working on my master's thesis in Wisconsin at the university there. This is a picture of him, his first day on the job. So he was the second graduating class of the Yale School of Forestry. He got a master's degree. That school was founded by Gifford Pinchot. Their objective was to manage forests scientifically. So he got trained in the new scientific way of managing forests. So he was posted in the southwestern US, and he was an assistant forest director, supervisor. And this is him. And all the stuff he's wearing, it's brand new. He's never been out west before. His mother got him that outfit. But he wrote about wolves. He called them varmints. And there he is with his men. Their job that day was to go out and cruise timber, which most of you probably know what that means. It means marking all the trees that can be cut. And while they were cruising timber, they had a second job to do. And a job that his boss, Aldo Leopold's boss, thought was as important as cruising timber. That was to shoot all the varmints that they saw. All the cougars, all the wolves, all the grizzly bears. There were still grizzly bears in that area, to kill them all. And he did, and he wrote about that. And so how many of you have read his essay, Thinking Like a Mountain? A lot of you have. Well, it makes it sound like he had this epiphany when he shot this mother wolf and watched this fierce green fire die out in her eyes. It didn't quite happen that way. He was exposed to, that incident happened around probably within a month of when this picture was taken, but he kept on killing wolves for another good 15 years. And what it took to change his mind was a lot of science that was being done by other people, other ecologists. There was this emerging view of how it wasn't about species, it was about ecosystems and nature's tangled bank. Every piece that was there had a role, and when you start removing those pieces, things start falling apart. And so this is what he wrote in 1936. To keep every cog in wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. So if you're going to try to restore a system or manage a forest, you need to have all the pieces present, especially wolves. By 1936, he was writing a lot about wolf conservation and predator conservation. So his vision was that we need to save all these pieces. He proposed wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone back in 1943. The park had him out because the park was an ecological disaster with so many elk, and the elk were wiping out all the vegetation. And they asked him, how can we fix this? And he said, you need to bring back wolves. So he was a visionary, and today we're starting to act on some of his ideas. So I'm going to briefly talk about trophic cascades. A cascade is a waterfall. Trophic just means related to the food web. So to have a trophic cascade, you need a keystone species. And a keystone species, today that term is used very broadly, but it was originally intended by the scientists who created it to refer to a predator, so a meat eater, that has a favorite type of a preferred prey species that it eats. In the case of the wolf, it's the elk. If it has a choice, if there's moose running around and deer running around, it will pick elk above them. And why is that? It's because it's a lot easier to kill an elk than it is to kill a moose. And a deer is almost as much work to kill as an elk, but only provides a quarter of the meat. So it's like cost effectiveness. It's like nature's economy. So when you remove that predator is controlling its preferred prey species. And when you remove that predator, ecosystems start to fall apart. And this term it's inspired by the idea of the keystone of a Roman arch that is holding the rest of the arch together without any kind of mortar. And if you pull out that keystone, everything else falls apart. So here are some examples from my field work. So this is an area that doesn't have wolves. And elk, these are aspens. And elk eat aspens because they provide an essential source of calcium and protein in the dead of winter when all the grass has been depleted. And what you get where there aren't wolves is this. No young aspen coming up. Well, they are coming up. They're just getting mowed down. This is a young aspen that was killed by being munched on too much by an elk. So it's like if you're pruning your roses, if you prune them once, they grow more vigorously, or any shrub really. If you prune them 20 times though in a season, what's going to happen to them? They're going to die. And so that's what happened to this aspen. And this is what you get where there are wolves. Same ecosystem. That's me and my field crew in the field. It's like a jungle out there. And that system has tons of elk, as many elk as that other site has, but it has 2 wolf packs that have been there for 25 years and are very, very active. This is in Alberta. And this is why. That's called the Ecology of Fear, and this is one of my field sites in Yellowstone. So that is the skull of a bull elk. What happened was it was being chased by wolves in winter. And wolves, genetically, they're most closely related to camels and horses. And so camels and horses, you've watched them run. They run with their legs stiff like this and their heads up like that. They're not like deer. They don't like jumping over stuff. And so when wolves chase elk into something like this thicket, behind this is one of my students, the elk hits this stuff and slows down and stumbles, and that's when the wolf get the elk. So an elk can normally outrun a wolf by about 10 miles per hour. Nature gave elk an advantage, a healthy elk, over wolves. But this is why we have this, because those elk avoid those thickets, those aspen forests. They nibble on the aspen around the edge, but they stay away from that interior because they can easily get killed by wolves. And in fact, in the interior of those aspen stands where there are wolves, I always find carcasses. They're like a boneyard. It's really interesting what's in there. And you don't see anything like that where there aren't wolves. Oh, and the other thing I should add is nothing else can kill an elk, an adult elk, regularly other than a wolf. So cougars, they take a small percentage of their diet consists of adult elk. Mostly they eat elk calves. So really, these adult elk, the only thing that can fully control them is wolves. So this is what happened. We reintroduced wolves, and it's like a letter J. We call this a J curve. It's not quite exponential growth, but almost. They just took off like wildfire, and this is exactly what we're seeing in Oregon and in Washington right now. So this is what happened. Here's another range map. This is the range of wolves when they were put on the endangered species list, and that is the upper Midwest. There were wolves up in Minnesota. This is what they were in 2008 when the federal government first started delisting wolves. And that triangular shape, those are the wolves in the northern Rockies. The black shape are wolves of the Mexican gray wolves. Okay, now this is 2014. So this is 2008. This is what we have today. Yeah. Yeah, it's stunning. So in Oregon, here's what happened. The first wolf that was found here had a radio collar, so we knew it was here. And it was promptly captured, put in a crate, and shipped back to Idaho. That was '99. But more wolves started following. You know, that was just one that had a collar on it. In 2000, there was a wolf that was road-killed, another that was shot illegally. In 2007, another one was shot illegally. This is a wolf that was spotted from the air. It's B3000. It's another radio-collared wolf in Oregon. Radio-collared outside of Oregon that came into Oregon. And finally, in 2008, ODFW announced that there was a breeding population of wolves confirmed in Oregon. So in Oregon, there is a wolf conservation and management plan. It is considered one of the most progressive plans of its kind. It resulted from several years of collaboration between members of the conservation community, ranchers, hunters, biologists. It gave the wolf endangered state status. Now, not all states have endangered species lists. Only about half of the states in the United States have an Endangered Species Act and list to go with it. And this plan, it's a pretty detailed plan. It's not like a blanket one-size-fits-all plan, more like what we've had in places like Montana. So this line here, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with wolf management in Oregon and what the policies are. That's Highway 97 and 395 and 20 in the north. And to the right of that, those wolves are considered part of the Northern Rockies wolf population and managed the way the Northern Rockies wolf population is, which means right now they are not protected. They've been delisted since about 2010. 11, really. They were listed and delisted 3 times between 2008 and 2011. The Oregon plan gives them, to the west of that line, the western zone as it's called, those wolves are totally protected under the State Endangered Species Act, and federally they're totally protected. So the eastern wolves are not protected federally, but they are protected still by the State Endangered Species Act. I suggest if you're interested in wolves to read this plan. You can download it online. All you need to do is do a search on Oregon Wolf Conservation and Management Plan. It has so much really cool information, like all that historical material. But it's really interesting. And if you are passionate about wolf conservation issues, or afraid of what wolves are doing because there's so many of them, as some people are, whatever your perspectives on wolves, this is really essential reading. So this plan has a multi-phase policy. Phase 1 is 4 breeding pairs for 3 years. phase 2 is 5 to 7 pairs, and a breeding pair is defined as a male and female who give birth to a litter of pups, and the pups survive till at least December of that year, and they usually whelp their pups in March or April. And phase 3 is 7 pairs for 3 years. Now, where this gets interesting is that each of these phases needs to happen in each of these zones, in the east zone and the west zone. So even if wolves are delisted in the state of Oregon in the east because they reach the criteria of, and they would be in phase 2 is when the delisting would occur, what goes on in the west would be treated separately. So I just want to show you some of these images to give you an idea of how fast things are changing for wolves in Oregon. These are wolves in 2011. Those are confirmed packs. These are some of the pups. I think those are from the Wanaha pack. So there's a lot of people out on the ground looking for wolves, biologists who work for the state, students at universities, field technicians, looking for evidence of wolves and documenting how this population is increasing. This is the following year. So back here, there's what, 3 packs, 4 packs? Now there's 6. And this is a report that reflects data as of the end of 2012. The 2013 wolf report has not been published yet, but I have talked to ODFW officials, and some of them are estimating there may be as many as 10 packs now. So they issued a media release about 1 pack, and that pack is, I believe it's in this area right in here. But also note that they're all clustered in that northeastern corner of the state. So these are elk populations. These are elk management units. I'm a hunter. I hunt elk. And so when you get each state manages their elk differently, but in some states when you get an elk tag, it pertains to a particular management unit. So these are, again, the wolf packs. That's where they are. And these colors pertain to elk density. So this is really high, and this is like really low. Look at, they're all above management criteria, or whatever their target goal for the elk population, they're mostly all above that. So there's a lot of food for those wolves in that area. It's a good place for them to be wolves. But there are other things there. There's ranching there, and that is creating some problems. And I'll talk about that in a little while. This is from the 2012 wolf report. We really don't have any official report about what was the situation at the end of 2013. ODFW's wolf site, I teach classes on this at Oregon State on carnivore management and policy and natural resources. And ODFW has one of the best sites. It makes a whole lot of information accessible to anybody. So if you're interested in wolves, I strongly suggest that you just spend some time browsing their website. So in the East Zone, ODFW expects that wolves may be delisted as soon as 2015 if the trends continue for their numbers to keep increasing like that. And of course, the delisting, they would have to file a rule at the state level, and then people would be allowed to comment on that, and there would be peer review, scientific peer review, and all sorts of things. So it's not a quick process, and there's lots of give and take in that process. So OR7, how many of you have heard of OR7? Yeah, this is Journey, as he's popularly called. And the state of California called me in to consult about him and to help them with their wolf management plan, which they're in the process of drafting. So this was his trajectory when he dispersed, and he was an 18-month-old wolf. He was a pup doing what these young adult wolves do. They just get this half of them decide they're going to go, and there was a collar on him. So this may seem like a remarkable journey, but what we really don't know is how many other wolves are doing this, because we don't put collars on every wolf. So there may be a lot of others doing this. So this, Defenders of Wildlife and other conservation groups created this map. And this shows you, this was as of early 2013, I think. So here's the Oregon-California line, and here's OR7 in the first 3 months. This is actually 3/1/2012, sorry. So this is the first 3 months he was in California. This is what he did. And this is a California Fish and Wildlife map, and this is more detail on what he did. Whoops, he got picked up by a trail camera here, and this is in California. He got photographed here by wildlife agents out in the field. And all of this here, these represent like weekly increments. He had an Argos collar on, and usually you get data. You can set it up different ways, but typically you get the data delivered to your computer once a week. So these look to me like they're weekly movements for him. What did he do in California? Well, we know he was probably looking for a mate, because that's what dispersal is about. They have this urge to find a mate and set up their own territory. We know he hasn't found one. He's back in Oregon, and he's alone. What did he eat? Well, people were holding their breath. There's a lot of sheep in that part of California, and they were hoping he'd stay out of trouble, and he did. Mainly, he ate deer. So he ate white-tailed deer, I believe is a species that's in that area. And he ate a few small mammals, but mainly he made his living by eating deer. So he proceeded to do, he's like a textbook perfect wolf. He did everything right, except he couldn't find a mate. So now he's back in Oregon. He did go back to California for 1 day. In Washington, I'm not going to spend much time talking about this because I don't have enough time, but the same thing that's happened in Oregon has happened in Washington. So this is the most recent map. So there's 10 wolf packs here. A year before this was released, the previous map showed 6 wolf packs. So those wolves are increasing almost exponentially in Washington too. So now we're going to talk about some North American wolf myths. There's a lot of fear, uproar about wolves and livestock, and that wolves are wiping out all the elk. Well, I can tell you they're not wiping out all the elk. There's so many elk in the areas where I work in the Northern Rockies. I hunt them. I can tell you they're really hard to hunt now because they're super wary. And people I know, I'm not the world's greatest hunter, but I have friends who have been hunting for 40, 50 years and who hunted for 2 months this year and did not get their elk. And they're totally okay with it because to them, it's about this relationship between humans and the natural world. And maybe this is what hunting is supposed to be like. And that's how I tend to look at it. But there are other people who are used to getting their elk the first day of hunting season because the elk used to stand around like lawn ornaments. You can't do that anymore. And so I had elk on my land where I live in Montana, and wolves recolonized our land. And the elk used to just stand around complacently like they were horses, like they were tame, eating. And now they're there, but they're just making these quick movements, and they're super wary. And we watched wolves hunting deer on our land, and we see their kills all the time. And those elk have to behave completely differently. They're wild again. So anyway, this is a figure that shows what wolves do. This was compiled by some people in U.S. Fish and Wildlife in 2005. So out of all the causes of cattle death, that's where wolves are. domestic dogs kill a lot more cattle than wolves do. So, however, it's psychological. So the livestock that does get killed by wolves, people react to it a lot. You know, you don't see stories in the news about somebody's dog killed their calves. You don't see that, but if a wolf does that, it's big news. So this is a trail camera in northeastern Oregon, and these are depredating wolves. Wolf depredation is considered to be an ongoing problem, a significant problem since 2009 in northeastern Oregon. Now, significant, it matters what your perspective and your worldview is. So there have been 64 confirmed kills by wolves in that area, both sheep and cattle and some domestic dogs. What percentage of, since 2000, this is since the year 2000, so what percentage of all of the livestock lost in that area is that actually? Probably it looks like that figure I showed you. However, to some people, this is a lot. So what are we doing about that? Well, in 2011, the state passed a wolf compensation fund law. And so it not only reimburses ranchers for their losses, but it helps pay for non-lethal wolf deterrence. And I'm going to explain what those are. And then House Bill 3452 passed last year. It's a controversial bill. It resulted from conservation organizations suing the state over wolf management, and a settlement was reached. And this was a compromise and a collaboration. And so it made killing depredating wolves a little bit easier. However, ranchers had to demonstrate before they were given a permit to kill wolves that they had done everything they possibly could. Now, what this information doesn't tell the story of, there were a lot of ranchers doing things that attracted wolves to their ranch lands and not being responsible stewards. So you can't, when there are wolves around, you can't leave things like gut piles and bone piles out there, because what that does is it draws the wolves in, and it increases the odds that they could do something bad. Most of the time, 95% of the time, wolves are not going to do anything bad, but then you have situations where they do, and that creates a huge conservation problem. So this bill was a compromise. If you ask the conservation community, if you ask the ranchers, you know, no side is totally happy with it, but it's a compromise. And the ranchers feel more supported, and the conservation community feels more heard. These are some of the non-lethal depredation deterrents. So it's a strategy that's in this bill, is very spelled out, and it's also in the Wolf Conservation and Recovery Plan. You reduce attractants, so no more boneyards. So ranchers used to put all their dead animals in one spot on their land, usually somewhere in the back, you know, but that really was a significant attractant. Fladry and fencing, so the bottom picture shows what we call fladry. And turbofladry, you electrify the fence as well. And so the flags, the wind makes them move, and that deters predators from coming in. And range riding, so you can ride with your stock. You can have dogs with you, as you see in this picture. If you have sheep, there's very special breeds that are specifically trained to protect sheep. Human presence is a big deterrent. Alarm or scaring devices, so there's rag boxes, devices that just randomly make really loud noises. And some people use that type of thing in vineyards to scare away birds, for example. They also work for wolves. So, however, the thing to keep in mind is that none of these, wolves are incredibly intelligent. I've had dogs all my life. I've had really intelligent working dogs. And I've been around wolves a lot, wild wolves. And the wild wolves are like 100 times more intelligent than even my most intelligent dog. So wolves, if they want to depredate, they'll depredate. And there's 2 packs in Oregon that have been repeatedly depredating. And so how to deal with that is a problem. It's not simple. And so husbandry practices, it's not just about bone piles, it's about this whole attitude. So I have friends who are ranchers. I come from a ranching background. I have friends who are ranchers who have had 0 depredation on their lands in areas that have high numbers of wolves in the northern Rockies. And what they do is their attitude is not that, well, those wolves are supposed to leave us alone. It's more of this give and take and stewardship and caring attitude about their land, their livestock, and the large predators, and accepting that large predators are here and learning how to live with them. And it's like a gestalt. It's like this whole approach. And when people, instead of fighting wolf presence, accept it and find ways to coexist, coexistence is a lot easier than people think it is. So with that, I'd like to thank the University of Oregon and the Museum of Natural and Cultural History for bringing me here. The College of Forestry at Oregon, where I've done most of my research through my affiliation with them, the Boone and Crockett Club, who supported some of my wolf research, Island Press, my publisher, and David Hibbs and Bill Ripple, who were advisors of mine. And Dave Moskowitz, some of you may have heard of him. He wrote Wolves in the Land of Salmon. He took a couple of the photographs in this show, but his book is, he's worked for me in the field, and his book is a really good resource for anybody who wants to read more about wolves in the Pacific Northwest. So with that, I'll take questions from any of you that has questions. I also brought copies of my book, The Wolf's Tooth, and afterwards, if anybody would like one, please come see me. Yes?
Is it true that the alpha male and alpha female are the only mating couples in packs?
The question is, are the alpha male and female the only breeding animals in a pack? Yes. And the way they do that is that the other wolves do not become fully hormonally active. Their hormones are suppressed. So when the alpha male and female, they're the ones that produce the hormones that are necessary for breeding. And some packs, I've studied packs that have had 35 wolves in them, and several of the packs I've studied have had more than one breeding pair. So if you get a really, really big pack, like 35 wolves, yes, or even 20 wolves, they usually will have 2 breeding pairs. And then sometimes those packs will eventually split. In my case, none of them split. But yeah, they have 1 breeding pair generally. That's the average situation. Yes, back here?
Okay. If you're paying for dead cows, there's motivation to claim the wolf killed the cow. How rigorous proof is required to say that cow was killed by a wolf?
Well, that depends on where you're talking about. There's a long history in places like Idaho of what some, like Carter Niemeyer, he wrote this book called Wolfer. If you haven't read it and you're interested in depredation and predator control, I suggest that you read it. He's a major wolf conservationist today. So in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming especially, there has been a lot of fraud. Some say that in Washington, some of the reports of wolf kills really weren't. In Oregon, all the documents are online. Anytime there's a depredation reported, ODFW does what you call a necropsy. That's what you're supposed to do. That's like a wildlife autopsy, and you can tell by the bite marks and also the wound whether the animal was already dead or when it got bit into by a wolf, whether it was alive or dead. You know, because sometimes animals just die, and so that's not depredation. A wolf comes along and eats a carcass. I think in Oregon they're very thorough, and I think it's an honest system from what I've seen. I haven't really heard reports otherwise. There were a lot of conflicts between 2009 and 2010 with ranchers reporting things that were not true depredations, and people getting very upset about stuff like that on both sides of the issue. But I think ODFW is doing a pretty rigorous job. Yes, over here?
I can't remember if there is still a bounty for coyotes. I know we're allowed to hunt cougars as well. So with the introduction of the wolves and the still hunting status for coyotes and cougars, how are they mixing together, and what's the impact of the wolves coming into the coyote and cougar territory?
So the question has to do with bounty system for coyotes and the impacts of wolves coming into coyote and cougar territories where cougars and coyotes are allowed to be killed, and how that dynamic will work. I don't know specifically about coyote bounties in eastern Oregon. I know a lot of places still have coyote bounties. And I know that cougar management in Oregon is liberal, and liberal is a funny word. And when it comes to hunting regulations and predator removal, liberal means that you can kill them freely, basically. So animals are classified as game animals and predators. Predators are considered vermin, and you don't need a license to kill them. And so a coyote is classified as a predator. A cougar is classified as a game animal in Oregon. So it is managed for hunting. You buy a license and you can hunt it. A coyote, you could do anything with a coyote. There's a whole lot of science that shows that coyote killing is not smart, because when you kill coyotes, what happens is they only increase their reproductive rate. So even though we've been killing coyotes very aggressively, and I was in a film produced by the National NRDC about predator killing, we have invested enormous resources on killing coyotes, and we have 3 times as many now than we had 40 years ago. So it doesn't work. So wolves moving into that, it's highly doubtful that they'll be managed as predators in this state, ever. What will happen down the line will be that there'll be a hunting season on them only after they've met recovery criteria. In terms of their interactions with coyotes, where wolves return, coyote numbers go down, and what I've heard in Northeast Oregon is that coyote numbers have decreased. That happens initially. Then the coyotes learn how to work around that, and they distribute themselves differently, and their numbers start to go back up. Back there in the red? Yeah.
Has there been any evidence in eastern Oregon of ranchers baiting wolves like they do with other predators with poison to try to eliminate them when they come near the ranch?
The question is, are there incidents of ranchers baiting wolves with poison to kill them? I am not aware of any, but I am aware of those kinds of incidents in other places. And I know that in places like Utah and Colorado, people use poison bait for coyotes, which is legal in many places. And sometimes wolves will accidentally eat that. And some would say that sometimes people use those poison baits quite liberally in a deliberate manner. But I have not heard of that happening in Oregon. Yes, over there?
You mentioned that with the introduction of wolves, the behavior of elk, they become more wary. Do domesticated animals like cows and sheep become more wary, or are they just, stay the same?
Yeah. The question is, wolves make elk more wary. Do they have that same effect on livestock? And absolutely yes. In fact, there hasn't been very much wolf research done in Oregon, but there was one study done on the Hall Ranch in Northeast Oregon where they put radio collars on cattle, GPS collars, so they gave a location like every hour of where the animal was, or even more often than that, and GPS collars on wolves. And then they tracked them relative to each other, and when wolves were with the cattle, they measured what the response was of the cattle. And the cattle changed their behavior dramatically. They moved around more, they bunched up more. The net effect on cattle has it, if you have wolves in an area where there are cattle, the cattle don't gain as much weight as they do. And so when they go to market, the reduction in the market, what the rancher makes off that head of livestock is reduced by maybe 15%. That doesn't sound like a lot, but if you are, many ranchers are not doing very well financially, that can mean the whole, you may be in debt that year because of that loss. So in some places, they compensate ranchers for that loss too. So that's been discussed in places like Washington. See, back here in the black?
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that there's 2 packs here in Oregon that are still causing problems with depredation. Is the Imnaha pack one of them?
Yes. Yes, the question was that I mentioned that there were 2 packs, and is the Imnaha pack one of them? And the answer is yes. Now, the early reports of depredation, there was a lot of controversy in how things were reported. ODFW has changed their practices, trying to tighten things up, and made it so that the burden of proof is really on the ranchers if there is a depredation. And I looked at all of the investigations that they did in the last year, and out of all of them, maybe like a quarter of them ended up being confirmed as wolf kills. And even so, it seemed to me like the agency was erring on the side of extreme caution in saying that a wolf actually did this. So, back over here in the black.
Is there agreement in your world, in the research community, of the beneficial effects of trophic cascade in, say, Yellowstone, for example, as it's been studied? I hear detractors that, well, the presence of the wolf, it's not a certainty that it's benefiting the entire ecosystem. What can you say about that?
The question is about trophic cascades, and is there agreement in the scientific world about trophic cascades and whether wolves are really having a strong top-down effect? That's an excellent question, and that's what my research has been about. And the answer to that is what I tell my students usually when they ask me a question about ecology. My answers typically start with, well, it depends. So first, you need to have an ecologically effective number of wolves. So having the wolf population we had in 2009 here in Oregon is unlikely to drive a trophic cascade. That's just not enough wolves. Trophic cascades, I didn't talk about this tonight, but you have the top-down effect of the wolf, and then you have this bottom-up effect of rainfall and moisture and anything that makes nutrients in the soil that makes things grow, and fire, which creates a disturbance. So I've been doing experiments with fire, wolves, and elk and aspen, and looking at the role of something like fire in increasing trophic cascades effects. And the system I work in the Rockies is a very wet system, and I'm finding that without fire, it takes a huge amount of wolves to drive a trophic cascade. If you add fire to the system, you can have like a more moderate amount of wolves, which is what you would normally find in most places where wolves are back. And so wolves and fire work together. In terms of, there is a pretty raging debate that has to do with the Yellowstone science. And I am in the process of starting work in Yellowstone to look at the effects of the wolf hunt and bottom-up and top-down forces, and bottom-up things like drought, for example, on trophic cascades, because those trophic cascades in Yellowstone are very patchy. They're not uniform. If you go into that park, you see areas where the aspen look like the ones I showed you in my picture, where they're thriving. And then right next to them, there'll be a spot where the aspen are being like hammered. And bison can't really eat aspen. They can't digest anything with lignin, which is the fiber that's in anything that has wood in it. So it's really an elk and aspen linkage there. So these relationships are really complex. But even given all of that complexity, wolves have a really powerful effect in ecosystems. And really, wolf conservation, as a scientist, I live in a part of Montana that backs my cabin when I'm not here teaching. I've lived in this place for 20 years. My cabin backs up to the Bob Marshall Wilderness, which is the second largest wilderness area in the lower 48. It's 1 million acres. Wolves recolonized that area. I had this big meadow on my land where the elk used to stand around like lawn ornaments at dusk and eat all the shrubs down to nothing. They were like the height of my ankle. We thought that was beautiful. I wasn't an ecologist back then. We'd eat dinner and watch elk, right? Well, wolves came back, and one day I was gardening with my daughters. We have a little fenced-off postage stamp yard, and then all of our other land is just wild. And there's this meadow and forest all around it. And the forest is second growth, mixed conifer forest. Well, this deer exploded out of the woods into the meadow, running like I've never seen a deer running. Its legs were stretched out like it was a racehorse. And right behind it were 2 wolves. And within 4 years of that, our meadow ceased to exist. All the shrubs and aspens were growing above my head. There were still lots of deer and elk, but they couldn't stand around like they used to. So do these relationships exist? You bet they do. Do they apply everywhere all the time the same way? No. And I'm also interested in starting some research in Oregon looking at these effects, because nobody's really looked at trophic cascades in Oregon. And there's a lot of forestry, for example. The wolf map I showed you, that corner of the state, it's mostly national forest. There's a lot of grazing allotments in there. There's some industrial forests, and there's a very high elk density. So I'm interested in looking how wolves are changing elk behavior and what impacts that's having on things like Douglas firs, for example. So back here. Okay.
Regarding the wolf-coyote relationship, has there been any work done on the relationship between the presence of wolves and coyote depredation of small livestock, the sheep and goats and things they like to go after, since the wolves change the way that the coyotes move, like some coyotes will move into the hills and things to avoid being caught out in the open by the wolves. Has there been any research into whether there's an effect on livestock losses when the wolves move into an area? Sorry, livestock losses due to coyotes.
Yeah. That hasn't been formally studied in Oregon, but that's what people are reporting. The question was about wolf impacts on coyotes. Is that changing coyote behavior or reducing their density such that livestock losses to coyotes are diminishing? And that's what appears to be happening in northeastern Oregon. It's been much more documented in places like Alberta. So yeah, the wolf is the top dog, and coyotes know that. And so their behavior changes pretty dramatically when wolves are around. And the reason there's such a coyote problem, if you want to call it that, that's how ranchers refer to it, is because we took out all the wolves, and wolves were controlling coyotes through competition and pressure from the top down. So when we removed wolves, coyotes, there were probably never as many coyotes as what we have today.
Let's thank Dr. Eisenberg.
Thank you.
I'd like to remind you once again, there's an opportunity to purchase tickets for next week's events. And if you'd like to ask your additional questions, we'll be here for another 10 minutes or so.